Her torn receipt, a silent conservatory, and a murder no one saw coming. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I'm your host, Alexander. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Now then, let's uncover the truth. It was a bright June morning when the death came to Bickford Grange, though no one would have known it by looking at the gardens. The roses were in splendid bloom, tea roses, climbing roses, the soft, cream-petalled varieties favoured by Lady Honoria, Greaves herself, all bobbing gently in the summer breeze as though untouched by the hidden tension gathering in the manor house's drawing-room. Bickford Grange, with its gravel drive and Georgian symmetry, had been the social crown of Bickford-on-Haven for nearly 2 centuries. The estate was old money and older secrets, but for the past 12 years it had belonged, at least in image, to Lady Honoria, a widow of powerful charm and inscrutable views. The occasion was meant to be pleasant, a charity tea for the local hospital's new wing. There had been cake, sponge and seed, baked by Miss Downey at the rectory. There had been lemon syllabub brought in from Lower Fernley. There had even been a trio of violin students from the local conservatory playing beneath. The open French doors, while bees buzzed languidly at the window panes. It was, in short, a fine English affair, full of clinking china, floral dresses, and the faint undercurrent of social one-upmanship that thrived best when paired with a delicate sponge. Miss Marple had attended, of course, though she preferred to sit quietly under the dappled shade of the apple tree rather than mix too freely with the Grange's habitual guests. She had noticed, without consciously thinking about it, that Lady Honoria had spoken only once to her great-nephew Jeremy during the entire event, and when she did, her voice was clipped. Jeremy, meanwhile, had been hovering near the trestle, table like a moth to flame, overly generous with the elderflower cordial, and speaking too quickly whenever Miss Lorna Waverley approached. But what Miss Marple noticed most, more than the subtle snub of Honoria to her niece, more than the fact that Mr. Tillett the solicitor had looked distinctly green after a bite of the salmon mousse, was that Lady Honoria's butler, Doyle, had slipped out of the house with a small paper in his hand and had not returned before. The screaming began. It had been Lorna who screamed. She had gone to fetch more tea napkins, there were always more napkins to be fetched, and had entered the conservatory. Moments later, her shriek rang through the rose garden like a bell at evensong. Guests spilled their tea. Mrs. Banbury of the Historical Society dropped a whole plate of Battenberg. Inside the conservatory, sprawled against the stone tiles in a most unnatural angle, was Lady Honoria Greaves, dead. The position of her body suggested a sudden collapse, perhaps apoplexy or a bad turn of the heart, but even a glance revealed the stillness was far too complete. There was a tray of garden shears tipped sideways at her feet, a shard of glass in the corner, and on the little writing desk near the fig tree stood a pot of ink, uncapped, and a blotter with the barest smear of blue. And beside the desk, crumpled, and partially tucked beneath a pair of gardening gloves, was a folded receipt, or what looked like one, pale, tissue-thin, its curled edge lightly stained with something pinkish, raspberry cordial perhaps, or a faint smear of lipstick, a conservatory repair receipt from Hartridge and Sons, dated 2 months past. The constable was called. Inspector. Darnley from Muchminster arrived before sunset, his jacket flapping as he demanded witnesses and ushered startled guests into Lady Honoria's panelled dining room. Chairs scraped, Teacups clinked as people drank in nervous sips. Lavinia Cotterell, who had fancied herself in line for Lady Honoria's heirloom brooch collection, kept touching her throat as if the diamonds had already vanished. "Must have slipped," murmured Reverend Potts to no one in particular. "Dreadful business. Poor woman." Miss Marple said nothing. She was not one to leap into declarations, especially not when the conservatory floor had clearly been cleaned recently. The tools were too neatly placed, and the receipt, yes, that was odd, had a faint crease across the bottom as if it had been pocketed, then hastily returned. As the villagers whispered among themselves, their theories already blossoming with the vigor of village gossip, Miss Marple stepped softly back into the drawing-room and let her eyes wander across the room's polished frame. The morning had started with roses and cake. It had ended with suspicion and the faint scent of damp ink. And Miss Marple, sipping her tea with mild expression, was already beginning to think that nothing about Lady Honoria's death was accidental. Not the receipt, not the scream, and certainly not the silence of Doyle, the butler who had yet to return. In Bickford-on-Haven, no tragedy ever remained private for long, not with Mrs. Banbury heading the Historical Society and the Bickford ladies, literary circle meeting every other Thursday, with biscuits and binoculars. By the morning following Lady Honoria's untimely death, the news had spread with the precision and swiftness of a well-tended rumour. People spoke of it in the post-office queue, in hushed tones over Sunday roasts, and while fingering radishes at the greengrocer's. Some whispered that it was simply her heart. Others insisted it was the salmon mousse. A few, those who considered themselves shrewder, blamed the heat in the conservatory, though it had been a mild 19 degrees by the Vicar's barometer. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned to her cottage on Church Lane with quiet efficiency. She fed her cat, watered her geraniums, and wrote 3 letters before elevenses. But her thoughts returned again and again to the details inside the conservatory. That receipt. The gardener's gloves, moved surely, not dropped. The curious fact that Lady Honoria had worn her sapphire brooch that afternoon, the one she reserved only for parish matters or hostile relatives. She had seen the brooch flash when Honoria was speaking, rather curtly, she thought, to Jeremy Greaves, the much-discussed great-nephew with a promising future in estate law and a less promising one in emotional maturity. Jeremy, for his part, was seen the following day walking briskly through the square, his collar unbuttoned and his expression taut. Mrs. Hemmings, the butcher's wife, had passed him, and later described him to her friend Nora Tilling as twitchy as a ferret in a henhouse. At the Red Fern Inn, Inspector Darnley had taken up temporary residence, using the snug parlour as his base of operation. He had already summoned several of the Grange's guests, each ushered through the side entrance by Doyle, or what would have been Doyle had he reappeared. The butler was as yet still missing. He might have had an appointment, suggested Mrs. Drayton, the vicar's sister. A dental one, perhaps. They do come up quickly, emergencies and the like. But privately, most agreed. No butler worth. His salt would disappear after his mistress died suddenly under his watch. Even Inspector Darnley, not given to poetic musings, found it peculiar. Vanished, he told his sergeant, tugging at his ear. 1 minute folding napkins, next, gone. No message, no sighting, not a crumb. At the literary circle that Thursday, it was the sole topic of conversation. Miss Lavinia Cotterell insisted she had seen Doyle step into the side garden with a letter in his hand. "I know it was a letter," she repeated, waving a buttered scone for emphasis. It had that crumpled look, as if someone had taken it from the rubbish and read it too many times. I saw a stamp, blue. French, I think. "And what would a French letter be doing at Bickford Grange?" asked Miss Templeton, whose idea of foreign culture extended to apricot jam. "That's the point," Lavinia said dramatically. "It wasn't supposed to be there." Miss Marple didn't comment. She was watching Nora Tilling, who had grown noticeably still during the exchange. Miss Marple had always considered Nora an underrated observer, one of those people who noticed everything, but said nothing until prompted, like a diary waiting to be opened. At the end of the meeting, Miss Marple approached her gently. "You looked thoughtful, dear," she said, offering her arm as they strolled toward the vicarage. "Something on your mind?" Nora hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sure it's nothing, Miss Marple," she said. "Only I went to the conservatory the morning after to leave some lilies, you see. Lady Honoria loved them, always said they reminded her of Tuscany." Miss Marple nodded. "But the conservatory door," Nora continued, "it was unlocked." Miss Marple looked at her. "That would be strange, wouldn't it? After such a dreadful event, surely everything would be sealed until the police were finished." "It should have been," Nora agreed. "But there was someone inside Mr. Easton. I only glimpsed him, but he ducked quickly like he hadn't meant to be seen." "Rupert Easton?" Miss Marple asked, gently keeping her tone curious, not accusatory. "Yes, that's the one. Works with the family solicitor, doesn't he? Tall, polished shoes, very stiff collars. Lady Honoria always called him our indispensable paper pusher." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what did he say?" "Nothing," Nora said. "He didn't see me, or if he did, he pretended not to. But I noticed something." Miss Marple waited. "He was holding a folder," Nora said quietly. "It looked like it had receipts in." That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and lit the small lamp by the window. The village beyond was calm, its cottages wrapped in twilight. But in her mind, the pieces were moving into position. The receipt in the conservatory, the disappearing butler, Rupert Easton, paperwork man, slipping back into the conservatory after police had taken control, and Lady Honoria's brooch, an object of statement, rarely worn without motive. It was still early in the mystery, Miss Marple reminded herself, but already the motives were beginning to rustle beneath the surface like leaves beneath a hedgerow. She reached for her pen and, on a note card in her finest copperplate, wrote, "To observe is to witness is to see the pattern." Then she underlined the word "biachui kamo pattern" once, very carefully. On Friday morning, a fine mist hung over Bickford-on-Haven like a net of silk, clinging gently to the hedgerows and softening the red tiles of the village rooftops. To the casual observer, the village seemed much the same as ever. Milk left on doorsteps, postmen humming past garden gates, the faint rattle of teacups from parlour windows. But beneath the familiar rhythms the air felt strained, as though the quiet were listening. Miss Marple took her morning walk earlier than usual, a habit she had adopted when something was troubling her. Not that she would have admitted to being troubled. Rather, she preferred the word puzzled, a much more dignified emotion. There was, after all, no rush. Truth revealed itself slowly in such places, like a watermark on paper, only visible when held to the light at the proper angle. Her steps led her past the solicitor's office on Foxwell Lane, a prim little building with leaded windows and a brass plate so well polished it was rumoured that clerks used their elbows. The name etched into the glass read, Tillett, Easton and Blythe, Estate and Probate Law. The door was ajar. That in itself would not have stirred her curiosity. But the voices inside, raised, sharp with something that was not quite anger, made her pause just a moment longer. "You're being absurd, Rupert," came the voice of Mr. Tillett, the senior partner. "The will has been lodged. We must wait for the coroner's findings before we so much as consider revision." A beat of silence. Then Rupert Easton's voice, cooler than Tillett's but with a brittleness beneath it. "And I'm telling you that something isn't right. Lady Honoria made mention of new provisions just days before her death. She said she intended to sign a codicil. I was under the impression it had been prepared." "It had not," Tillett replied firmly. "I would know. You overstep yourself." Miss Marple, of course, did not eavesdrop, but she did linger by the holly bush for a full count of 20 before moving on, her mind turning slowly. Her codicil, a last-minute adjustment to a will. That could change beneficiaries, cut some out entirely, redirect heirlooms or properties, and if it had never been signed, at the greengrocer, the talk was still of the death at Bickford Grange. "But now with a twist. They say the sapphire brooch is missing," murmured Mrs. Eltham, selecting a bruised pair. Miss Marple turned gently toward her. "Oh, I thought Lady Honoria had worn it that day." "She had," confirmed Mrs. Eltham, "but the maid swore it wasn't on her when she was found. Not on the floor, not in the conservatory. Inspector Darnley asked everyone if they'd seen it fall, but no one had. Gone. That evening, Miss Marple received a caller. It was Jeremy Greaves. He arrived at 6:30, his collar neat but his eyes tired. She invited him into the parlour, where the mantel clock ticked softly and the scent of chamomile hung in the air. "I won't take much of your time, Miss Marple," he said. "Only I understand you were at the Grange the day of my aunt's passing." "I was," said Miss Marple kindly. "A dreadful shock. My condolences." He nodded, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Thank you. It's all rather surreal. Honoria was formidable." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "That's one way to describe her. She was also, I think, a woman of strong convictions, and not easily fooled." Jeremy hesitated. "I didn't kill her," he said, not looking at Miss Marple. She nodded slowly. "I didn't say you did." "But you're thinking it," he said, "or at least suspecting. Others are, you see. I had financial problems. Nothing dire, just bad timing. The market, a few poor investments. My aunt had promised to help, but she changed her mind, said I needed to learn discipline." Miss Marple's knitting needles lay idle on her lap. "And did you?" He gave a dry laugh. "I suppose I did, in the cruelest way." She tilted her head. "Might I ask something, Jeremy? Did your aunt mention anything to you recently about changing her will?" He looked up, surprised. "She did, actually. Said she intended to leave something to Miss Waverley. I didn't mind. Lorna was devoted to her. And the codicil. She mentioned it would be signed soon. But that was weeks ago. I never saw a new draft." Miss Marple nodded once. "And the brooch, the sapphire?" He paused. "I assumed it was taken by the thief, if one existed." Yes, said Miss Marple softly. If one existed. After. He left. She sat still for some time. The facts were beginning to form a silhouette. Lady Honoria had intended to amend her will. Someone stood to gain or lose from that amendment. The sapphire brooch had vanished, and Rupert Easton, who claimed to be her legal conscience, had slipped into the conservatory after her death, holding documents. And yet it was not the lawyers, or the heirs that preoccupied Miss Marple most. It was the butler. Doyle's absence was too clean, too silent. A man does not vanish from a house in crisis without intention, or without being made to. The next morning Miss Marple made a quiet inquiry to the postmistress. Has Mr. Doyle received any parcels recently, or forwarded any? The woman frowned. Not that I recall, Miss Marple. Oh, except a slip 2 weeks. Cargo package from France. Came with an unusual label. I remember because Doyle asked for it specifically and signed in a rather odd hand. Shaky it was. Miss Marple smiled politely and thanked her. Outside the sun had broken through the mist. It bathed the thatched roofs in gold and lit the conservatory windows of Bickford Grange with a clear, crystalline gleam. Miss Marple looked toward the Grange, and then toward the solicitor's office. There was something brittle in the air now, something ready to break, and when it did, she suspected more than one carefully tended illusion would come tumbling down with it. That Sunday evening, just as twilight pressed its cool fingers against the window panes of St Edmund's Rectory, Reverend Puckle lit the candles in his sitting room one by one. He was a man fond of tradition, and even though the electricity worked perfectly well, he preferred his Vespers hour to be by the flicker of flame and the hush of old books breathing on their shelves. He had invited Miss Marple to supper, a small affair, merely soup, cheese and baked apples, but with the understanding, of course, that conversation would carry most of the nourishment. You know, he said thoughtfully, slicing a piece of Stilton, I buried Lady Honoria's second husband, old Major Prescott, some 15 years ago, much disliked, but he kept a meticulous herb garden. I remember it well, said Miss Marple. He used to bring sprigs of thyme to the Women's Institute bake sale, and grumble if no one used them in the scones. They shared a smile. And now, the vicar continued, her own sudden passing. It has shaken the village more than we're used to. Even my curate's gone pale about it. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes softening. It's unsettling, to be sure, but I find what comes after the shock more telling. How people shift, rearrange themselves. Human nature's ripple effect, Puckle murmured. Exactly, said Miss Marple, and certain ripples don't quite follow the expected pattern. She recounted, gently and without embellishment, her observation of Rupert Easton in the conservatory after the death. She omitted nothing but her speculation. The vicar leaned back. A solicitor meddling about after a death, especially with papers, is a serious thing. I thought so too, said Miss Marple. More serious, still when combined with a missing brooch and the whispered matter of an unsigned codicil. The candlelight flickered along the edges of her spectacles. And what of the butler? The vicar asked. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I've always believed in the character of household staff, Reverend. One doesn't serve in a place like Bickford Grange for 15 years without a sense of duty. Doyle wasn't careless. His vanishing isn't mere coincidence. The following day brought a change in weather and in temperament. Rain spattered the windows, slicking the cobbled paths and sending the village children indoors, their laughter replaced by the ticking of clocks. Miss Marple, however, never let weather interfere with necessary errands or inquiries. At the baker's, she happened to meet Miss Lorna Waverley, the Grange's long-time companion and sometime secretary. The young woman looked unusually pale, and her hands, which usually fidgeted with her handbag clasp, now remained motionless at her side. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "how very wan you look." Lorna managed a smile. "Just the strain, I suppose. There's been so much to sort." "I understand." "I do hope Lady Honoria's effects were left in good order." Lorna hesitated. "Mostly. There was one matter." Miss Marple waited with gentle silence. "She left instructions for a letter to be delivered posthumously, to be given to Mr. Easton, but I can't find it. It was in her desk drawer in the brown envelope she told me never to open, just to pass on. I saw it only a few days before she died." "And it's gone now?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Lorna nodded. Miss Marple considered this. A letter, intended for the solicitor, vanishing from a drawer only days after its last confirmed sighting, after the woman in question had died unexpectedly. "If you'll forgive an old lady her persistence," she said kindly. "Was it sealed?" "Yes," said Lorna, "very firmly, thick wax. And her seal. She always used that little thistle stamp." Miss Marple gave her a sympathetic look, and they parted with the warmth of shared unease. By midweek, the coroner's report had arrived. Was unremarkable. Cause of death, heart failure. No suspicious substances in her system. No external injuries. No definitive cause for concern. But this only served to deepen the shadow for Miss Marple. Deaths of convenience, she had found, were never as straightforward as they seemed. Nature rarely accommodated the schemes of mankind, but it did so just often enough to provide cover. And then came a curious detail. Rupert Easton appeared at the Grange with a locksmith. He claimed, according to Mrs. Hemmings, who had overheard, while delivering veal, that Lady Honoria's desk had been locked and the key mislaid, that it had become imperative to retrieve documents related to property holdings. But Miss Marple recalled Lorna's words that she herself had handled that desk drawer not days before. So who had locked it? And why? The answer, Miss Marple thought, must lie with someone who feared what the letter might say. Someone who had either taken it or had reason to know its contents would threaten their standing. And then, in the Evening Post, arrived something wholly unexpected. A small envelope, addressed in a faintly familiar hand, with a French postage mark. Inside was a single folded sheet. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "if this reaches you, it means I've chosen to disappear. Not cowardice, only necessity. I saw something I should not have. I fear my presence may now be dangerous. You have always understood people in a way others don't. Look to the papers, look to what was moved, not what was taken. The truth lies in what someone believed was insignificant. I trust you." It was signed simply, E. Doyle. Miss Marple read the note twice, her expression unreadable, so the butler had fled. Not for guilt, but for fear, and he had entrusted her with a riddle, one she suspected was already unfolding before her eyes. That night, she lay in bed listening to the rain on the roof, her thoughts winding through the shadows of motive and misdirection. What had Doyle seen? What was it about the papers in the conservatory, The receipt, the missing codicil, the sealed letter that had stirred someone to act. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to see more clearly. Morning, she knew, would bring another ripple, and this time it might disturb the very heart of Bickford Grange. The rain that had pattered gently across the village rooftops through the night gave way by morning to a grey hush, broken only by the creaking of shutters and the rustling of birds in wet hedgerows. In St Mary Mead, days like these wrapped the countryside in a kind of woolen stillness, as though even the sky were holding its breath. Miss Marple, however, was brisk and purposeful. She took her breakfast promptly at 8, a soft boiled egg, toast and orange marmalade, and afterward dressed with care. Her tweed coat had been brushed, and she chose a hat with a modest blue ribbon that matched the sky when it chose to be kind. She had a destination in mind, not Bickford Grange, nor the solicitor's office. Both had already yielded their share of unease. No, this morning her course turned toward the Bickford Lending Library, where the mundane met the personal with surprising frequency. If ever one wished to know the inner patterns of a village, the preferences, anxieties, or vanities of its people, it was not in diaries, but in lending records that one might look. The library was a squat Georgian building that smelled delightfully of paper and lavender polish. Inside, the windows misted softly, and the librarian, Miss Pamela Lister, looked up with a practised smile. "Miss Marple," she said cheerfully, though her eyes hinted at the tired curiosity so many in the village now carried. "You've arrived. Early." "I find mornings the best time for thinking clearly," said Miss Marple, "before the mind becomes cluttered." Miss Lister, used to such remarks, merely nodded. "Looking for something in particular?" "Actually," said Miss Marple with a light laugh, "I'm hoping to find something someone else looked for." She left it at that. But she spent the next 45 minutes in the reference section, browsing the card index, looking not at books but at names. It was not exactly proper, she knew, but as Miss Marple often said, morality and discretion were not always the same thing. She was looking for Rupert Easton, and there he was. Not a frequent borrower, too busy, no doubt, but he had come in the week before Lady Honoria's death, taking out a slim legal text, Trusts and Contested Estates, a review of recent precedent. Interesting. Even more curious was the next name. On the card, entered in the same pen, perhaps by the same hand, Miss Lorna Waverley. She had borrowed Notable Women in English Gardening, a charming volume, if a little dated. The two books were stamped out on the same day, minutes apart. Miss Marple tilted her head. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences piled like leaves in autumn. Each by itself might mean little, but together they marked the shape of a change. She thanked Miss Lister, borrowed a copy of an atlas of English country houses, and made her way back into the soft drizzle. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Weatherby, who, being the niece of Lady Honoria's late housekeeper, was more than willing to speak freely about the goings-on at the Grange. "She was particular, you see," said Mrs. Weatherby, pouring tea with a flourish. "Everything done just so. Even had a preference for which pens were used in her correspondence. Blue ink only, and the little crown seal from Harrods." Miss Marple listened with interest. "Blue ink, you say? Not black?" "Never black," said Mrs. Weatherby. "Said it made everything look too much like a funeral, and she'd slap your hand if you tried to write on that off-white paper she kept in the second drawer. Only ivory bond, nothing else." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts drifting. These were the kinds of details no inspector would ever ask after, and yet they mattered. Later, as she walked home, she was met at the gate by Constable Ramsay, young, earnest, and forever slightly damp behind the ears. "Miss Marple," he said, tugging at his cap, "Inspector Darnley asked me to pass along a message. There's been a development. They found Doyle's suitcase." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Oh? Where?" "Left at the rail station in a locker. The porter turned it in when no one claimed it. And what was inside? Clothes, mostly. A small collection of French postcards, oddly enough. But there was also a folded receipt, or what looked like one. Some sort of note from a conservatory company." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "May I see it?" He hesitated, but her tone brokered no resistance. At the station, the inspector met them with the suitcase already open on the bench. In the back office, the receipt was indeed there, crumpled and creased, but still legible. Miss Marple read it carefully. "Re Lady Honoria Prescott. Payment received in full for delivery of 3 replacement panes for greenhouse conservatory structure. Additional service, removal and disposal of original broken panel. Signed, A. Bartlett." The date on the receipt was curious. It was for the Friday before Lady Honoria's death. "Did you know she had a pane replaced?" asked Darnley. "I did not," said Miss Marple, "but I rather think that someone didn't want it known." She turned the receipt over and held it to the light. The ink was not blue. It was black. Back at home, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire. She laid the receipt on her side table and studied it again. The handwriting was neat, the signature modest. But there was something about it that felt off. If Doyle had kept it, it meant he saw value in it, and if he feared for his safety, he would have taken only what mattered most: a conservatory panel replaced, a pane of glass removed, and perhaps a letter or codicil hidden within it. If one wished to conceal a document in a hurry, glass could serve surprisingly well. Folded carefully, slipped between panes, almost invisible, but someone had removed that glass and perhaps unknowingly, or very knowingly, taken the document with it. She folded the receipt and placed it back in its envelope. The puzzle was not yet complete, but she had the corner pieces now. The following morning brought with it a sky the colour of dishwater and a breeze that teased chimney smoke down into drawing rooms. In St Mary Mead, shutters rattled and cats took shelter beneath privet hedges. But despite the gloom, Miss Marple dressed in a wool skirt and sensible shoes, and took her umbrella from the stand. She had an errand to Bickford Grange. Not that she was invited, of course. Her purpose was not to visit, but to observe, quietly, deliberately, and with the kind of sharpness that only came from a lifetime spent understanding the masks people wore, and the things they preferred to leave unsaid. The gates of the Grange stood open, no longer out of respect, but because no one had yet thought to return them to their usual shut and orderly stance. The garden, which had once been Lady Honoria's pride, now looked slightly unkempt. The roses drooped from too much rain, and the gravel drive bore the faint impressions of a recent vehicle, deep, uneven, and not the type typically left by the Eastern firm's tidy roadster. Miss Marple took this in with no more than a glance. She moved along the garden path with measured steps, pausing, ostensibly to admire a fading hydrangea, but actually to take in the conservatory from a different angle. It sat at the back of the grange like an appendage of glass and iron, modest by estate standards, but proud in its Georgian lines. Ivy curled along its lower panes, and from within one could just make out a few wilting ferns, a cane chair, and the echo of conversations long past. There was someone inside, Rupert Easton. He stood by the far wall, examining something in his hand paper. He folded it sharply, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and turned toward the little workbench near the potting tray. His movements were too precise, not the relaxed habit of someone tending plants, but the measured actions of someone looking for something, or hiding it. Miss Marple continued on, circling toward the side entrance of the grange, and just as she passed beneath the library window, the door opened. It was Lorna Waverley. The young woman jumped slightly when she saw her. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting—" "No one ever does, dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "I just happened to be walking past and thought I might return Lady Honoria's volume of The Herbalist's Companion. I found it in the church reading nook. Must have wandered off during one of her visits." Lorna hesitated, eyes flicking toward the hallway beyond. "Oh, yes. Of course, you may come in, but only briefly, please. Things are rather unsettled." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I understand. Such a time, isn't it? Loss has a way of making even furniture seem unfamiliar." Inside, the house smelled faintly, of Polish and fire smoke. The staff, it seemed, had thinned. Only one maid remained, and she appeared startled to see a visitor. Lorna led the way to the drawing-room, where she took the book and set it on a low-side table beside a dusty vase of dried lavender. "I do hope," Miss Marple said gently, "that Rupert isn't burdening you with too much. It must be difficult, sorting the affairs of someone so particular as Lady Honoria." Lorna gave a strained smile. "He's doing what he must. There's talk of a probate filing next week. He says there's no point in waiting." "No trace of the missing letter, then?" Lorna's face shifted ever so slightly. "No," she said quietly. "And I've looked everywhere." Miss Marple nodded. "It's always the things meant to be hidden that vanish first. But I've found over the years that most things, if important enough, leave echoes. A smudge, a disturbed drawer, a wrong scent in the right room." She did not press further. Instead, she asked after the conservatory, and whether the new panes had held well in the wind. "Oh, yes," said Lorna, "though I hadn't even realized they'd been changed until Doyle mentioned it before he left. I believe he oversaw it all himself. He was quite proud of how clean the job was." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "It's curious that a pane should need replacing at all. Glass doesn't often break without cause." Lorna's voice dropped. "There was a storm, or that's what I assumed. But Doyle seemed oddly vague when I asked. Said something about a tool falling, though no one ever found it." Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave, walking slowly down the garden path again, this time letting her steps bring her close to the conservatory door. It was unlocked. She stepped inside quietly. The scent of damp soil and faint mildew clung to the air. Lady Honoria's gardening gloves still rested on the bench beside a trowel. A copy of The Times lay folded on the chair, untouched since the day before the funeral. Miss Marple moved gently to the wall where the new glass had been fitted. The S.C. frame bore the faintest trace of putty, still slightly uneven at the edges. A rush job, perhaps. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a magnifying glass, pretending for a moment to inspect a fern's leaf for blight. But her attention remained on the seam of glass and metal, a thin line, no wider than a pin's width, and just beneath the ledge a smear, faint but unmistakable. Ink. Not just any ink. Blue ink. She stood back and examined the floor. Nothing obvious. No scraps, no discarded envelope, but the nearby potting table had a drawer. Inside were seed packets, a rusted hand spade, and a pair of cracked spectacles. At first glance, nothing of consequence, but taped to the underside of the drawer, nearly missed, was a folded square of thick, ivory-coloured paper. Miss Marple gently peeled it free. It was blank, at least seemingly so. She held it to the light. A faint impression, barely visible, traced across the surface. The pressure of once-written words, now erased or faded with time. She slipped it into her handbag. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the faint moan of a chime. Swinging from the conservatory's gutter, Miss Marple walked away from Bickford Grange with more than she'd come for. She had no answers yet, but she had at last a direction, and in mysteries such as this, that was as valuable as any confession. By the time Miss Marple returned to her neat little cottage on Old Mill Lane, the clouds had lifted just enough to let through a gauzy shaft of sunlight. It lit her parlour in a soft yellow glow, casting long shadows from the silver-framed photographs on her mantelpiece, quiet reminders of a life lived mostly in observation. She placed her handbag on the table with the same care she gave to setting a teacup, and drew out the folded ivory paper she had recovered from the drawer beneath the potting table. It was blank to the eye, of course, at least in the ordinary sense. But blank things, Miss Marple knew, often held more than they revealed. She fetched her small magnifying lens, the one she reserved for needlework and other delicate examinations, and sat by the window where the light was best. The faint indentations became more visible under the magnification. Not ink, no, just pressure. A letter once written, perhaps removed or copied. She turned the paper at an angle and caught a single word traced in careful script: codicil. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in quiet confirmation. Codicil. That much, at least, was no longer theory. It might have been written on that very page, perhaps even by Lady Honoria herself. But the ink was gone. Whether faded by time or removed by human intent was impossible to say for certain, and yet there were impressions. Letters still danced faintly beneath the surface, enough for one with patience to reconstruct. Miss Marple did not possess forensic tools, nor did she need them. She had instead a kind of simple wisdom, passed from governess to schoolmistress, from hymn book to household recipe, gently dusting the page with fine powder, charcoal in this case, ground from the hearth and applied with the soft bristle of a sewing brush. The result was not perfect, but it was sufficient to reveal portions of sentences, like whispers rising from deep water, bequeathed to Miss Lorna Waverley the sum of, in addition to the conservatory and all contents, therein, to be delivered in confidence upon my passing. The powder trembled in Miss Marple's hand. She had known it, or suspected it at least. Lady Honoria had not only intended to leave something substantial to Lorna, but had done so privately, away from Rupert's notice. And not just a sentimental gift, a sum of money, possibly the entire conservatory itself, and whatever was hidden or housed within. But if this codicil existed, and she now had every reason to believe it had, Why had it not surfaced? Why had it been erased? Who had discovered it before it could be formally read? Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. She recalled Rupert's moment in the conservatory, the careful folding of that paper, and his earlier legal research at the lending library. Too many converging points to be dismissed. Yet it was not only Rupert who raised her suspicions. Doyle's strange evasions, Lorna's hesitant demeanour, the missing glass pane, and the very fact that this blank document had been taped beneath a drawer rather than destroyed outright. These details formed a tapestry far more intricate than any one person's deception. She glanced at the clock. 4:15. Tea was not a luxury at such an hour. It was a necessity. As she waited for the kettle to boil, Miss Marple penned a note in her tidy hand. It was addressed to Inspector Darnley, requesting a brief meeting the next morning, not at the police station, but at the groundskeeper's cottage near Bickford Grange. She did not elaborate. She rarely did. The next morning was sharper, brighter, the kind of English morning that deceived with light and froze with wind. Miss Marple arrived at the cottage a few minutes before the appointed time. Inspector Darnley was already there, pacing slightly. "I must say," he greeted her, "this place gives me the shivers. Empty houses do that, especially when they're so recently occupied." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Grief leaves a kind of echo, Inspector, but so does guilt, and I believe this place still remembers both." She led him around the back, past the woodpile, to a disused tool shed that had once served as a greenhouse. "Storeroom." The door hung slightly askew, but the padlock had been recently replaced. Darnley raised an eyebrow. "This isn't on the list of places we searched." "No," said Miss Marple, "because you were looking for a person. But the key to the mystery, Inspector, is not just who did what, but what they were trying to protect or conceal." He opened the shed. Inside, amidst broken terracotta pots and weather-worn seed tins, was a crate marked with the faded logo of Bartlett Glass and Conservatories. Darnley approached, pried it open with the flat of his penknife, and revealed inside a stack of old conservatory panes, carefully layered between straw and brown paper. Miss Marple picked one up with gloved hands. There, etched faintly along the edge of the glass, was the letterhead of Harwood Solicitors. "Well, I'll be—" muttered Darnley. "She hid it in the glass?" "No," corrected Miss Marple gently. "She entrusted someone to hide it there, someone she believed loyal, but either that person faltered or someone else got to it first." The inspector looked over. "Do you believe the codicil was hidden in one of these panes?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that it was hidden between them, slipped between two sheets of glass like a pressed flower, then sealed and forgotten, or so she hoped." Darnley turned back to the crate. "We'll need the entire lot examined, carefully." Miss Marple nodded. "And quietly, please. I would not like certain ears to hear of it just yet." That afternoon, word spread that the solicitor's office in Lower Darrington had received a curious inquiry, someone asking about codicils, about the destruction or amendment of unwitnessed addenda. A male voice, careful, educated, unwilling to give a name. Miss Marple, sitting by the hearth with her knitting half-finished in her lap, listened as the details came through Constable Ramsay's report. "A codicil destroyed is a codicil denied," she said softly. But even as she spoke the words, she knew the truth was slipperier than that, because a codicil destroyed could sometimes still speak. If only someone would listen closely enough, and Miss Marple always listened, even when others had stopped. The sun filtered weakly through the clouds. The next morning, casting a pale shimmer across the puddled cobblestones of the village high street, Miss Marple, ever punctual and neatly turned out, made her way along the edge of the road with the careful pace of someone who had long since mastered the art of appearing idle while absorbing everything. Her destination that morning was none, other than Weatherby's second-hand books and stationers, a narrow ivy-trimmed shop that sat like a forgotten hymn book between the butcher's and the greengrocer's. It was a place often overlooked by those in haste, but never by Miss Marple. Not because of the books, though she found their dusty company comforting, but because of the man who kept it. Mr. Horace Weatherby, once a librarian in Bath, had settled in St Mary Mead for his health some 20 years earlier. He knew everyone, and everyone's reading habits, an underrated form of intelligence, as Miss Marple often reminded herself. As she entered, the little bell above the door gave a delicate tinkle. Mr. Weatherby, perched on a stool behind the counter, looked up over his spectacles. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I was just putting aside a volume of Cowper's letters that I thought might interest you." "How thoughtful," she replied with a warm smile. "For though this morning I'm more interested in something a bit more recent, legal in tone, if you will." Mr. Weatherby blinked, adjusting his glasses. "Legal? Yes. I understand that some weeks ago a certain Rupert Easton inquired about literature pertaining to codicils and the amendment of wills. I believe he may have asked about reference materials, something discreet." Weatherby's face remained composed, but his fingers paused in their tapping. "He did indeed. Came in rather unexpectedly. Said he was preparing a lecture for a civic, the club, something to do with estate law and historical practices. He wanted old editions, books not easily found online, you know." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he mention a title?" "Only that he was particularly interested in the formal requirements for handwritten codicils. He was quite clear that he wanted information on what could be considered valid in the absence of witnesses." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, as if they were discussing embroidery floss. "And did he find what he was looking for?" Mr. Weatherby gave a regretful shrug. "I had an old treatise from 1893 that touched upon such matters. Dry as dust, really, but he seemed intrigued. Spent nearly 40 minutes reading it here. Didn't take it with him, oddly. Only made a few notes. May I ask what he used to make those notes?" "A blue fountain pen, I believe. Quite particular about it. Said ballpoints were vulgar." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "One always reveals oneself by one's tools. Did you happen to see where he wrote them?" "Back of a grocery receipt, I think. I only noticed because it bore the Pigot's Conservatory shop stamp in the corner. A curious thing to write legal notes on." "Indeed." She stayed a moment longer, making small talk about book bindings and Victorian authorship, before purchasing a slim volume on English gardens. As she exited into the chill of mid-morning, her mind was quietly alight. A grocery receipt from Pigot's Conservatory shop, of course. The so-called missing document. It was not the codicil itself that had vanished. It was the evidence of it, the mention, the trace, the proof that it had ever been intended. And if Rupert had jotted notes on the back of a receipt, possibly even his own, then the name of the shop, and perhaps the item purchased, might yet hold weight. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and made her way to Pigot's, a tidy glass-house showroom at the edge of the village. where hanging pots and window boxes were always artfully arranged and the scent of damp moss lingered in the corners. Inside, she was greeted by a young man named Daniel, son of the elder Piggott, who now spent most of his days tending seedlings rather than customers. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerily. "Looking for winter jasmine again?" "Not today, Daniel. I'm afraid I'm being terribly forward, but I wonder if you might humour a small curiosity. Do you happen to recall a Mr. Rupert Easton purchasing anything here in the last month or so? Possibly something unusual?" Daniel scratched his chin. "Easton, oh yes. He came in one rainy afternoon, 2-3 weeks ago, I suppose, bought a small pane of custom-cut glass, said it was to replace a broken section in Lady Honoria's conservatory, didn't want delivery, took it himself. Would that have been a standard transaction?" "Not exactly. He was very particular about the thickness and clarity. Said it had to match something already installed. I remember because he paid in cash and asked for a printed receipt, which isn't our usual habit." Miss Marple brightened ever so slightly. "And would you happen to keep copies of such receipts?" Daniel vanished into the back room. After several minutes of muffled rummaging, he returned with a carbon copy ledger. "There we are. Rupert Easton, 28th last month. 1 panel, greenhouse. Grade custom cut, cash payment receipt issued." Miss Marple thanked him, making careful note of the date and description. It was the same day Rupert had visited Weatherby's. The pieces were forming into a sharper outline. Rupert had inquired about codicils, written something down on a receipt from a conservatory shop, and purchased glass that could conveniently conceal such a document, either to preserve or to eliminate it. And yet, Miss Marple returned to her cottage not with a sense of triumph, but with the careful tread of one who had stepped deeper into a fog. For there remained the question of Lorna. Her inheritance had been intended. Of that Miss Marple was sure. But Lorna had said she had not seen the codicil, had not even known if it truly existed, and yet she had searched. She had searched, but not reported. The following day brought another subtle shift in the case. Constable Ramsay, red-cheeked from the cold, arrived at Miss Marple's door with word from Inspector Darnley. "The conservatory glass you found?" he said. "One of the panes was double-layered. Inside, they found an envelope. It had been slit open, nothing inside it, but it had Lady Honoria's seal." Miss Marple received the news with her usual calm. "Then it seems," she said, "we are now looking for not merely a murderer, but a forger, or worse, someone who knew the truth and let a death obscure it." As she poured tea for both of them, she added thoughtfully, "People believe murder is always committed in moments of anger, but often it is done quietly, with gloves on, after tea." The final pieces were close now, but there was still one final move to make, and it would require Miss Marple to do what she did best: listen, softly, while others talked too much. It was the sort of late afternoon that reminded Miss Marple of embroidery patterns left unfinished, grey with touches of faded rose, as if the sun had once tried to brighten the sky but had since grown tired. The village of St Mary Mead wore its quiet as a shawl against the world's greater fusses, yet under that calm something faintly bitter had begun to stir. Miss Marple, having returned from her errands and inquiries, settled herself in her drawing room with a small pot of tea and a plate of mild ginger biscuits. Outside, the wind was picking up in sporadic gusts, rattling the ivy against the windows. She was not alone. Across from her, seated with all the wariness of a guest who suspects something more is at play than polite hospitality, sat Mr. Rupert Easton. His pinstripe trousers were pressed, his tie a modest blue, and his face, though composed, bore the slightly drawn look of a man who had begun to realize he might no longer be the cleverest person in the room. Miss Marple offered him a biscuit. He declined. "Mr. Easton," she began, her tone as mild as warm milk, "you and I both know why I invited you for tea." He gave a slight, guarded nod. "You have questions about Lady Honoria's will?" "No, not questions," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "Only observations. You see, I find it rather peculiar that someone of your standing, so concerned with legal affairs, should be so careless with evidence." He blinked, his composure flickering. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," she said, her eyes kind but unblinking. "You made inquiries about codicils. You took careful notes, on a receipt no less, one from Pigot's Conservatory, shop where you had just bought a glass pane of uncommon clarity and thickness." He said nothing, but his jaw had tightened. Miss Marple continued, pouring tea with exquisite slowness. "The codicil did exist. I've no doubt of it now. Lady Honoria likely placed it in sealed form between two panes of glass. A clever hiding spot, but not too clever. After all, she trusted someone, perhaps even you, to retrieve it at the proper time." Rupert shifted, slightly in his chair. "But of course," Miss Marple went on, "once you discovered what it said, you realized that your inheritance might be considerably reduced, if not altogether eliminated. Imagine, it must have been a terrible shock, after all those years of loyal service." She paused, offering him a moment to interrupt. He didn't. "And so you removed the codicil, destroyed it, or so you thought, and replaced the glass to conceal any sign that it had ever existed. You may even have staged the pane's accidental breakage, a bit theatrical but effective." "That's a serious accusation," he said quietly, though without much strength. "I haven't accused you of anything, Mr. Easton," she replied. "I am simply speculating, and old women do that rather a lot, don't we?" She sipped her tea, letting silence stretch between them. He shifted again. "But there's something that bothers me," she said, setting her cup down gently. "You see, the envelope found between the panes, Lady Honoria's own, was slit, open, but not clumsily, carefully, as though someone had hoped to remove the document without damaging it." He raised an eyebrow. "Surely that proves nothing. Perhaps she changed her mind, or someone else found it." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Someone else. That possibility rather haunts me." Rupert said nothing. "I'm sure you're familiar with Miss Lorna Waverley," Miss Marple said with soft emphasis. "The young lady who inherited nothing." "I know her," Rupert replied, a touch too quickly. "She visited the estate often in those final weeks, always had a fondness for the conservatory, and a penchant for fiddling with things. But here is the real question. What would she do if she discovered the codicil but saw it had been emptied of its contents?" Rupert frowned. She might assume, correctly, that it had been removed, but whether out of fear or strategy, she said nothing. She began searching quietly, not to challenge you, but to recover something, perhaps a duplicate, perhaps a clue, or perhaps merely the truth. Rupert leaned forward slightly. "You're speculating again," Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed I am. But I have found that speculation, when paired with human nature, often leads us rather close to fact." He rose suddenly. "I don't see why I should continue this conversation," he said stiffly. "If you truly believe I've done something unlawful, you may speak to the police." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I already have." Rupert's face paled slightly. "Not to accuse," she clarified, "but to ask them to delay any formal action. You see, I needed one more piece." "And what piece is that?" "Your reaction," Miss Marple said simply. She stood as well, her posture as straight as ever. "It told me all I needed to know." He left without another word, and Miss Marple returned to her chair. There was no sense of victory, only quiet. To resolution. That evening Inspector Darnley came to call. "I think it's time," he said. "We've gathered enough. The solicitor's office confirmed that Lady Honoria requested 2 envelopes with her seal the month before her death. One for her formal will and one, presumably, for the codicil." Miss Marple nodded. "And the second?" "Nowhere to be found. But the envelope in the conservatory had impressions on the inside. We'll try to lift the indentations." "It won't matter," Miss Marple said gently. "Rupert already confessed it, only not to you. He didn't deny it clearly, and that in itself speaks volumes. But I'm afraid the truly tragic figure is Lorna." Darnley raised an eyebrow. "You think she knew all along?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think," she said, "she believed in loyalty too long. And when that loyalty proved unreciprocated, she chose silence over scandal. People do, you know, especially young women taught not to stir the waters." The inspector looked thoughtful. "And Rupert?" "He'll be careful, but not careful enough. And when you speak to him next, mention the conservatory pane. Watch how his hands behave. His mouth will lie, but his fingers will twitch." Darnley gave a small chuckle. "You really do see everything, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not everything. Just enough." Outside, the wind had begun to still. The village settled back into its quiet pattern, unaware that the last curtain on a deadly little play was slowly descending. But Miss Marple knew, and she had one more visit to make, this time to Lorna. There were still things unsaid, and wounds that needed quiet tending, because justice, when served cold, was rarely enough. Sometimes it had to be served with kindness, too. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of soil and sweet alyssum, as Miss Marple stepped through the gate at the edge of Green Hollow Lane. It was not the main path to Bickford Grange, nor was it commonly used, but it suited her purpose perfectly this morning. Private, shaded by overgrown hedgerows, and quiet enough to hear one's own conscience if one were in need of it. Lorna Waverley's cottage was a modest affair just behind. The Grange's eastern field. Thatched roof, whitewashed walls, and the telltale signs of artistic temperament scattered about, a rusting bicycle with a woven basket, clay pots stacked near the door, a blue apron forgotten on the line. As Miss Marple approached, the door opened with a gentle creak, and Lorna appeared, startled for only the briefest moment. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, brushing flour from her hands. "You gave me a bit of a start. I do apologize, my dear. I never like to intrude, but I thought a walk and a visit would do us both some good." Lorna hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in. I've just made bread." Inside, the cottage smelled warmly of yeast and something citrusy, perhaps marmalade, though Miss Marple wouldn't have dared to presume. The sitting room was small, adorned with bookshelves bowing under well-thumbed novels, watercolour sketches pinned to the wall, and an open notebook on the table, spine creased. Miss Marple sat where indicated, watching as Lorna fetched tea without asking whether it was wanted. This, too, was a kind of intelligence. "You've had callers lately," Miss Marple said, lifting the teacup to her lips. Lorna paused, then sat across from her. "The inspector came by yesterday. I told him what I knew, which wasn't very much." "You told him you had no knowledge of the codicil." "That's true." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, I suspect that, while you may not have known, you certainly suspected. Didn't you?" Lorna exhaled, fingers tightening slightly. On her own teacup, I thought something was off the way Rupert behaved. How he kept finding excuses to be in the conservatory, rearranging papers, claiming to fix a hinge on the old glass cabinet. "You knew Lady Honoria intended to leave you something. She mentioned it once, a small allowance perhaps. For travel. She always said she thought I was wasted here. And yet in the final will your name was absent. She wasn't herself in those last days," Lorna said softly. "Tired, anxious, sometimes forgetful." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Or perhaps she had done what she meant to do, added your name to her legacy in a separate document, one that someone else chose to misplace." The silence hung between them. "I thought if I said anything, I'd be dismissed as grasping," Lorna finally admitted. "Or worse, that people would think I was accusing Rupert." "Were you?" Lorna hesitated. "I didn't know what to believe. He was always so poised, courteous. But then one night, I found him in the conservatory with a pane of glass in his hands. Not installing it, examining it. You saw that? Yes, he didn't see me. I left before he turned." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled just slightly. "And you never told anyone?" "What would I say? That I'd caught the executor of the estate inspecting glass? It's hardly a scandal." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "But it is a clue, a quiet one. And that's precisely why I wanted to speak with you, before the next steps are taken." Lorna looked at her, confused. "There's more." "There always is, my dear," Miss Marple said with the faintest smile. "You see, the solicitor's office has confirmed that 2 envelopes were prepared at Lady Honoria's request, one for the formal will, one for a codicil, though no such document has yet been produced." Lorna's breath caught faintly. "They also confirmed," Miss Marple continued, "that Rupert inquired weeks before her death whether a codicil without witnesses could be challenged, particularly if the original were missing." "And that's enough?" "It's not conclusive, but it paints a pattern, one which has grown clearer with every step." Lorna stood and paced to the window. Outside, a robin pecked at the damp ground beneath the rosebush. "He'll deny it," she said. "He always denies things so calmly. People believe him." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but people also believe in proof. And yesterday, proof arrived." Lorna turned. They recovered the remains of the codicil, a partial page damaged but legible in places. Enough to indicate that Lady Honoria had left you not merely a sum, but the entire conservatory. Lorna sat down slowly. "I had no idea." "No, but Rupert did. And once he realized it, he sought to remove it quietly without the mess of legal disputes." Lorna's hands trembled, but her voice remained level. "So what happens now?" "The inspector will visit him again today," said Miss Marple. "It will be formal this time. I expect Rupert will attempt to remain composed, perhaps even suggest it was Lady Honoria who destroyed the codicil herself. But you don't believe that." Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Lady Honoria may have been proud, but she was not capricious. She made her choice and left it in writing. Rupert's miscalculation was assuming that no one would look closely enough to notice what was missing. And you did. I only followed the behavior, my dear. That's all. A guilty man hides things poorly because he forgets how often others are watching." Lorna looked away, quiet. "I feel so foolish." "You mustn't," said Miss Marple gently. "Your silence protected you in its way. It allowed the truth to emerge on its own terms." There was a knock at the door. Lorna opened it slowly. Inspector Darnley stood outside, his hat in hand. "Miss Waverley, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes." Miss Marple stood, gathering her shawl. "I'll leave you to it, my dear. I think you'll find this visit rather more reassuring than most." As she stepped back into the morning air, she heard Lorna's voice, a mixture of relief and uncertainty, and the calm professionalism of the inspector beginning his formal statement. Miss Marple walked down the lane slowly, the wind stirring, her scarf. There was no joy in what had happened, but there was resolution, and in cases such as these, resolution was the most one could offer. Justice, after all, was rarely dramatic. It arrived quietly, like morning light easing through an old conservatory window, faint, filtered, but finally complete. The sun, long absent from the village lanes, returned with quiet grace on the following morning, casting golden slants through the gables of St Mary Mead and turning puddles into mirrors. Spring's palette crept softly across hedgerows and window-sills, and for the first time in many days, the birds sang with unguarded cheer. At the end of Church Lane, Miss Marple's curtains twitched open as she drew back the lace and peered out into the waking world. Her morning ritual was one of quiet observance, of both nature and neighbours, not in a spirit of gossip, but of understanding. It was, after all, in the small shifts of human behaviour that great truths could be found. She turned from the window and moved about her sitting room with deliberate ease. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and the faint scent of beeswax from yesterday's polishing still lingered in the air. On the mantel sat the latest edition of the Daily Chronicle, and beneath it a handwritten note from Inspector Darnley, delivered that morning by Constable Ramsay. Miss Marple lifted the note and read it once more. "Miss Marple, Rupert Easton has been taken into custody. He confessed to removing the codicil and arranging for the glass panel to be replaced. He denies involvement in Doyle's death, but the coroner's report and timeline now make his alibi untenable. Lorna Waverley has been informed of the legal developments regarding Lady Honoria's estate. Your insight once again proved invaluable. You'll forgive me for saying I underestimated you. Darnley." She smiled faintly and set the letter down. Forgiveness was not required. She was used to being underestimated. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk toward the churchyard, pausing, as she often did, beside the stone bench beneath the sycamore tree. It offered a view of the village rooftops, the curling chimneys, the thin trails of smoke rising from afternoon hearths, all so ordinary and yet so deeply intricate. It was there she was joined by Reverend Dearborn, who approached with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple, might I intrude?" "Not at all, Reverend." "The bench is wide enough for two." He sat down slowly, smoothing his cassock and exhaling with the fatigue of a man who had offered too many condolences this week. "It's a strange thing," he said quietly, "how one small document could shift so many lives, legacies, emotions, even reputations." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but it's not the paper itself. It's what people believe it promises. Safety, justice, dignity, or power in some cases." Dearborn glanced sideways. Rupert Easton struck many as admirable, dignified, a man of sense. He was all those things, Miss Marple agreed, but none of those qualities are proof against envy. I suppose we must ask, why would someone educated, respected, choose to risk everything over a conservatory and a legacy not meant for him? Miss Marple's voice was soft, because he thought he could control the consequences, that no one would look too closely, that a receipt could be forgotten, that a pane of glass could be discarded, and that a death could be written off as unfortunate. Timing, Dearborn nodded. And yet it wasn't. No, because people notice things, they remember blue ink, or overheard questions, or the way someone rearranges a vase that didn't need moving. She fell quiet a moment, then added gently, "We often imagine that murder is committed in fury or desperation, but it is just as often committed in quiet calculation by those who believe their intelligence grants them immunity from consequence." Dearborn folded his hands, "And yet it's always the quiet ones who see through it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I only listen, Reverend. People do so like to talk." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as Lorna Waverley passed the gate toward the church office, her step a little lighter, her expression marked by a kind of thoughtful serenity. "She'll be all right, I think," said Dearborn. "Lady Honoria wasn't wrong to see something in her." "No," said Miss Marple, "and Lorna was never after wealth. She merely wanted recognition, that someone had seen her for who she was, that her presence mattered." Dearborn smiled. "It's often the smallest inheritance that means the most." As the bells of St Mary Mead chimed the half-hour, Miss Marple rose. "I must be getting back. There's a new delivery from the library. I've been meaning to reread The Moonstone, though I dare say it's less twisted than real life." "Only just," Dearborn said with a chuckle. She made her way home slowly, stopping to examine a rosebud near the vicarage gate, already unfolding in the sudden warmth. Life returned in such quiet ways, almost shyly after an ordeal. That evening, as twilight softened the sky and drew long shadows across the lawn, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a shawl over her knees and a journal open beside her. In it, she jotted her final observations, not for anyone else, but for her own clarity. It is not always the most outwardly suspicious who commit the gravest sins. Politeness and position can cloak much. One must look for the fracture beneath. The surface, the thing a person tries most to conceal, not with words, but with silence. She paused, then wrote, "In the end, truth is seldom loud. It comes like a breeze through an open conservatory door, quiet, invisible, but unmistakably present." And as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked gently into being above the rooftops of St Mary Mead, Miss Marple closed her notebook with a soft sigh of completion. The village had returned to its gentle routines, but beneath its calm the memory of the vanished receipt and the tragedy it uncovered would linger like the faint scent of lavender in an old drawer. She would not speak of it again, but she would remember.